faith, that means, as an engineer, I want to have Christ present in it and express my faith in love in my job. You see, if sola fide makes all the jobs equal, that's the type of faith that makes all the jobs equal value and priestly callings. It's very essential. Now we go to, you're still with me? That was the most theoretical theological part. Luther on vocation, beruf. The idea of vocation in English has two meanings, double meaning. And that's in many languages, I don't know in Korea. Where it can mean priesthood or going to a religious order. So going into ministry, as some people will say. I don't like that word because we're all in ministry, but still some people say, I go to seminary, I'm in ministry. That's vocation. But it can also mean, what is your job? What is your profession, your vocation? So there's a double meaning in the Latin word vocatio, the Greek kaleo, and the Hebrew kara is all in the background. It means God's sovereign rule in the Old Testament, kara. He calls his people and he cares for them. Now it had a very, what we call sacerdotal meaning, sacral meaning, vocation. Luther changed that, of course. And Max Weber, his book on Protestantism and capitalism deals with this in a separate chapter, to be precise, chapter 3, deals with Luther's view on beruf, vocation, very specific. What was going on here? Luther did something very strange but very typical. He, I think, and I think everybody agrees with that, he mistranslated 1 Corinthians 7:20 in his German translation. 1 Corinthians 7:20 is meaning, let each of you remain in the condition in which you were called. If you look in the context, it's about circumcision, it's about being Greek, being Jew. Stay in the condition, don't, if you're not a Jew, don't get circumcised. Stay in the condition you are. So that's the text. Now, very strange, maybe, he translates, ein jeglicher bleibe in dem Beruf, in the profession, daarin berufen ist. It goes well in German, yeah? So, it means that if you are a carpenter, don't become a monk. And so, stay in your profession, because your profession is how God has called you. That was very, and it demonstrates Luther high respect, although it's a mistranslation, high respect of how God calls people in their profession. It's a demonstration of that. It's a very technical discussion. I skip it a little, that's why I have it in smaller letters. Karl Barth also has a very interesting comment on that mistranslation of Luther in his Dogmatics. It's a long footnote. Another element that is very important for understanding Luther and much debated is what we call the two-kingdom theories. The two-kingdom model is that God is ruling over the world and his church in two ways. He is the ruler. The Anabaptists had a very antagonistic, dualistic view. He believes that God is the main ruler of the world, but he rules with grace and love in the church and with justice and righteousness and power in the world. And the sword, the power of the sword, Romans 13. It's a very complex idea in Luther and very balanced, I think. The one element that is often forgotten is that with the concept of beruf, vocation, you go from the one world to the other. So you are actually called by God to live in the other world. It is kind of crossing the boundaries of the two spheres, the two realms of God. And we see later that this is an important idea with Dietrich Bonhoeffer to see it that way. God works through his offices. It's not in the text, but in one of his works of Luther, when it's about the civil obedience, he discusses the profession of an executor. You know, the one with the sword that cuts off the head. Now, what about a Christian executioner? He says, should he leave his job? No, says Luther. It's better to be a Christian executioner than a non-Christian. Because Romans 13 says the sword is given by God and it's better than a Christian serves a sword and cuts off the heads than a non-Christian. It's very middle-aged and you're like, oh my goodness. But that's very coherent with this idea. This is your call, this is your job, you are an executioner. You can discuss this ethically, but it demonstrates Luther's idea on beruf, where you are, very well, as a kind of extreme example. This is an example I will add in the text later. Good. Yeah, maybe here another quote is maybe too long. Yeah, you have it in your text. But important is all works except for faith have to be directed to the neighbor. For God do not require of us any works with regard to himself, only faith through Christ. That is more enough for him. Here he makes a difference between works for the neighbor and love for the neighbor and faith for God. But all our motives of the sola fide has to be neighboring love in every profession. This is where I will ask Luther again, what about the executioner? Is that also an expression of love? Here is, I think, very incoherent, as most of those people are. Depends what text you're reading. Okay, let's make a step to more nowadays with Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, I suppose you know a little about him, that he was a gifted young theologian, for me the most brilliant theologian of the 20th century that we lost in the concentration in the camps of German camps with National Socialism. Died very young. I think he was 23 when he had his first PhD in theology. So I want to challenge you, if you already passed 23, you're too late. So a brilliant person. Died much too young, and a lot of his works are unfinished, and it's very mysterious. What would Bonhoeffer say? And we speculate, and that's why we have many Bonhoeffer interpretations. I'm aware of that. And one of the mistakes people often make in the Bonhoeffer interpretation are two major mistakes. First, they don't read him enough against the background of National Socialism and the whole discussion in Germany and what's happening there. And second, they don't read him enough as a Lutheran. They read from a Reformed perspective, they try to understand Bonhoeffer, or even Baptist or whatever, and that doesn't work. He's extremely Lutheran and very German. Max Weber is the one, and I go to the ethics of responsibility. From vocation, I go to responsibility, because that's my main model as an ethicist. That's the tradition of responsibility. There are many, Hans Jonas, Niebuhr, Ramsey, many in that tradition, and I see myself in that tradition, and Bonhoeffer is one of them. But the problem is that the concept of responsibility is a 20th century concept. So you will not find it in Luther or Calvin. It's 20th century thinking. And again, Max Weber is there. Max Weber, his book on Politik als Beruf, politics as profession, explains responsibility. Because being a politician is a profession. And that's a different way with consequences and responsibility. And Max Weber tries to describe that. And through Max Weber, it gets into moral philosophy and moral theology in the 20th century, and also in Bonhoeffer and others. Now Bonhoeffer, and this is the bridge actually, sees vocation and relates the Lutheran idea of vocation with responsibility. So he picks up his Lutheran tradition of beruf and connects it to the 20th century of responsibility ethics that has to do with the complexities of life and the tragedy of life. Vocation, he says, beruf, is the place at which one responds to the call of Christ. So, and thus lives responsibly. Calling means living responsible. Second, the task given to me, my vocation is just limited, but my responsibility to the call of Jesus Christ knows no bounds. This is interesting. He says, the Lutheran idea, you are called in a certain profession with certain gifts and certain specific situations. That's very, very, very limited. You're not responsible for the whole world, for everything. You have a very limited responsibility as a citizen, as a student. You have responsibilities as a student, as a professor. And that's the limitation. But as far as Christ is concerned, my responsibility is 100% towards Him. There are no bounds. And this is a professional ethics I want to see it develop in us. This attitude that Bonhoeffer describes here of responsibility. He makes responsibility Christocentric. He puts Christ in the center. That's very different from Max Weber, and even to a certain extent not so strong in Luther as it is in Bonhoeffer. It's all about living in the reality of Christ. Bonhoeffer speaks about Christ's reality. He says there is only one reality. That's Christ. He's kind of the ontological principle. If Christ is really the Lord over cosmos, He is the final, ultimate reality, behind all reality. And vocation is living out that reality. It is almost mystical. And again, here you see the sola fide of Luther in a very mystical way, of Christ mysticism, unity with Christ, experiencing that in your prayers, in your personal devotional life, and then in your responsibility. How does he define responsibility? And the text is a little more extensive than I can be now, and that's a lecture in itself, is mainly being there for man. For man, we would not say that anymore, for person, but that's how Luther describes it. Why? What is essential about Christ? Christ was there for us. Therefore, if my faith is participating in Christ, I am there for you. In my profession. As a nurse, or as a lawyer, or whatever. So being there for the other is the essence of Christian responsibility. Interesting, and he didn't finish that part in his Ethics, that's an unfinished book of Bonhoeffer. He picks up again the two kingdom theory of Luther, and he limits the responsibility of theologians and the church and the responsibility of Christian professionals. And I follow that pattern, I sympathize with that pattern. What does it say? It says the church should not take any political stand, or say what is the best economical system, or, and I'm applying now, saying as far as artificial intelligence goes, this is the limit, or this is this, or this is that. Because that's not the role of the church. That's the role of the Christian professional. The Christian professional is called in that responsibility and needs support from the church to live out that responsibility. It's a dialogue thing. The power of theology is the Word of God, but the power of the Christian professional is to be called in the complexity of his or her job. That's responsibility ethics. So as an ethicist, I apply that a lot. People in my country today, they call me in, so sometimes even big churches, they call me and say, oh, we want you to give a lecture on, let's say, something like gender issues, or no, not gender, let's say on homosexuality, or on issues like in vitro fertilization, IVF, things like that. And then they tell me at the phone already, in the invitation, what I have to say. Kind of, they give me the conclusion of my lecture, but then they need someone with some academic titles to tell the audience that that is the real truth about this. Now, I refuse that type of invitations, because I don't think that's my role. My role is to help people in the job and the profession to reflect themselves. Because we are all in sola fide, and they have to do the jobs. The whole idea of career preservation and the whole idea of define technological questions, you never can master that if you're not working in the field. But if you're Christian working in those areas, you often need theologians or Christian philosophers to give you the instruments yourself to think it through yourself and be responsible yourself. So that's a kind of very Bonhoefferian Lutheran way, where the responsibility is not with the church, but in the other kingdom almost, the two kingdoms. So vocation becomes responsibility ethics. And then my final point is the discussion about hope, and that's my main area of research at the moment, the effects of hope in society, and how is that in Bonhoeffer and in this model. I think that Christians in their profession should bring hope, and I agree that hope is very central to ethics. Now the main theologian and ethicist about hope is undoubtedly is still Jürgen Moltmann. Now why is Jürgen Moltmann important for me here? Because he reacts against the ethics of responsibility. He says, I don't want to have an ethics of responsibility like Hans Jonas and others. I want to have an ethics of hope. And I disagree with it, and I agree to a certain extent with him. So let's read Moltmann here. We become active insofar as we hope. We hope insofar as we can see into the sphere of future possibilities. We undertake what we think is possible. Realism teaches us a sense of reality for what is. Hope awakens our sense for potentiality, for what could be. In concrete action, we always relate to potentiality, to what exists, the present, to the future. It's a great definition of hope, especially, and that's how I summarize hope here, as the art of potentialities, looking at a situation, at a crisis, the tragedy of life, and still see potentialities. Today, someone told me that you have a day specially attention for people that have disabilities. Well, how do you look at them? Do you look at them with hope and look for new aspirational hope and potentiality even in a disability situation, or do you look only as we're responsible for that? Yeah, that's different, and I agree with Moltmann here, but that's where I disagree, is that I think this idea is the idea also of Bonhoeffer's ethics of responsibility, was precisely an ethics of hope. Because Bonhoeffer explained, and we should not contradict them, being responsible in your profession as a Christian means you have to look for new potentialities and growth and solutions. Although Bonhoeffer asked the big question, but can we change the world? And I noticed a slogan of this university, change the world, and I felt a little uncomfortable with that slogan. I appreciated it, and I had this double feeling, like, okay, yes, let's change the world. Bonhoeffer says we can bring solutions, Lösung, for the problems of the world, but we cannot bring redemption, Erlösung. And I think if you say change the world, yes, but don't think you can save the world. That's a step too far. We are called in very specific ways to bring solutions and help people with a humble spirit that we will not really solve all the problems. And that's the distinction Bonhoeffer makes between the ultimate and the penultimate. The ultimate is Christ himself and justification by faith and those big ideas. But the penultimate is how we have to live our lives at interim in our professions to bring solutions and hope where we can, in the little things and the tragedy of life. And Bonhoeffer himself demonstrated that in his own life, in his own calling. And we can read his biography, how he lived his life. So for him this was very real. He was in New York, in a very nice university, safe place, and he went back to his own country knowing that this probably could be the end of his life. So he's kind of a martyr. And people thought he was crazy, and he said, this is my call, this I have to do. And that's how he experienced this. So it's very small, looks very small, but that's kind of the imitatio Christi, the following of Christ in das voorletzte or the penultimate that we are called to. Let's come to a conclusion here. My conclusion is briefly that as Christians we have to live, to fight this professional dualism, that only those that are doing seminary or pastoring church are in ministry. This is crazy. This is unreformed, un-Protestant to think that way. But it's a part of our nature. Even when I go to a place and there's a meal, they ask me always to pray. And I hate that so deeply. Why am I always the person to pray? As if my prayer is better than another. No, I'm not. So sometimes I start a discussion, but that doesn't help at all. That makes it only worse. So I pray. Yeah, I pray. So we're all called to prayer as Christians. And this dualism is deep in us and doesn't help us in our scientific, technological capitalist society. Second, Christ is being there for the other. Sola fide means being there for the other in Christ. And how do you demonstrate that in your profession, in your studies, in your calling? Responsibility ethics, and I did spend maybe a lot of time on that, but our time is short, is in ethics a tragedy. That people live in a very complex world, have to make responsible decisions, choose often for the lesser evil. This is not a model of pacifism. This is even a model of just war theories and things like that. That you have to live in the tragedy of life, and it's not your responsibility often to take the decision. It's often the one in the profession that has that responsibility and needs the cross of Christ and forgiveness sometimes in that different type of situations. This is the road we have to travel, and I want to end with a conclusion, a quote from Bonhoeffer. We must travel a road, even though there is no road to this goal. And we must travel this road to the end. That is, to the place God puts us an end to it. The penultimate remains in existence, even though it is completely superseded by the ultimate, and it's no longer in force. So in the penultimate, we have to travel our own road that is not always so clear. Thank you for your attention.